Good morning. Good to see everybody here. Hope everybody's having a good Sunday morning so far. We're going to be in John chapter 18, where we left off last week, as we've been going verse by verse through the New Testament, and as a result, verse by verse through the Gospel of John. And last week we looked at Jesus in the garden. We looked at him being betrayed by Judas, one of his close companions, and we saw the pathway of suffering that he took as they crossed over the ravine and as they made their way to the Mount of Olives. And also we saw Peter strike Malchus in the ear, and Jesus rebuking him for it. And then the Roman cohort taking him away in verse 12. And that's where we pick up this week in John chapter 18 and verse 12. And there it says, "So the Roman cohort and the commander of the officers and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him." Now, as we look at this particular section in chapter 18, we can see the way that John lays out this chapter is introduced to us here in verse 12. Because you have two groups of people. You have the Roman cohort, which was made up of about 600 soldiers, which would have been under a Chilion, commander, which typically meant a commander of 1,000, but linguistically it can also mean 600. Won't go into a whole lot of detail there, but basically a Roman cohort of 600 soldiers plus the officers of the Jews. You have both the Romans and the Jews playing a part in binding Jesus and taking him away to trial. And this opens up the section of John chapter 18 where Jesus is going to enter into trial. And the Apostle John here splits it up in those two groups. First, he's going to stand before the Jewish high priest, Annas, and then he's going to stand before the Roman governor, Pilate. And John keeps it very clean. If you go to the Gospel of Luke, you find Jesus kind of bouncing around. He'll go to, before the Sanhedrin, then he goes to Pilate, then he goes to Herod, and then he goes back to Pilate. But John keeps it clean between these two groups. It's almost as though John is making a point just in that Jesus is both going to stand before the Jews and the Gentiles before being crucified. And both of those groups are going to play a part in his crucifixion and be responsible. Now, Pilate's a little bit the reluctant player in the whole part, but given his position, he had the right to release Jesus, and he didn't. He actually let them or allowed them to crucify him. And so you find both Jews and Greeks involved in this particular scenario. And it's interesting that it starts with the Jews, and then his trials will lead to standing before a Gentile governor. This very closely mirrors what the persecuted church would endure in the first century, the body of Christ. It's called the body of Christ, and they experienced the same thing. And if you go back and you look historically at the history of the church, you go through the book of Acts, you'll find that persecution began with the Jews and then led to Roman persecution. Oftentimes we think of the first century persecuted church and we immediately go to the Romans, but really it was the Jewish people that persecuted them first, and they only utilized the Romans insofar as they needed the authority to actually do what they wanted to do. About the time of Nero, that's when Roman persecution starts, but even then it's kind of sporadic and kind of waxes and wanes throughout history in the first few centuries. But it's very interesting that Jesus' trials very closely mirrors the persecution of the church that would take place later. But maybe more shocking than that is the fact that he's standing before man at all. Here you have Jesus, who in chapter 1 we're told created all things, and nothing was created without him. The creator of the world, the ruler of the world, the one in Revelation that be called the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the one in whom every knee will bow, the judge and ruler of the earth, is standing before man on trial. Think about how crazy that is, that he would be standing before some human court and subjecting himself to these various trials. But he's allowing himself to do so because of course, the plan and the purpose that God has already laid out. But this ought to just boggle our minds. God manifested in the flesh, Jesus Christ, standing before a high priest and standing before a Roman governor. But before we're too shocked about that, we can find even today this goes on. Isn't it true that mankind wants to put Jesus on trial or wants to put God on trial. Oftentimes we don't see him as the ruler and the judge of the universe, but we see ourselves as the ruler and judge. In other words, we want God to operate the way we want him to operate. If he doesn't operate the way that we want to, we put him on trial. Why did you do it that way? I can't believe you did it that way. Or why does he have these particular laws and commandments? I don't agree with those. And we put him on trial as though we are the judge, as though we are the creators, as though we have the ultimate authority in the universe. However shocked we might be that Jesus is standing before a human court here, we should be just as shocked that we oftentimes put Jesus before us in our own court. We got to remember our place in the whole scheme of things. He is the ruler. He is the king. He is the one who calls the shots. And our role is just to submit to him, be devoted to him, and love him with all of our heart. But this is what we're going to find. We're going to find Jesus before the high priest, the one who later would be called the great high priest, the one after the order of Melchizedek, the one through whom he would be not only the high priest, but also the sacrifice as well. Not only the sacrifice, but the very temple of God. He would be the one that would fulfill all of the Old Testament sacrifices. The whole role of the high priest would be fulfilled in him. And yet now he's about to stand before the high priest, Annas. So they take him, they arrest him, and they bound him. And we talked about last week how shocking that is too, that they would bind Jesus. Clearly Jesus was in control. When they asked, when he asked, who are you seeking? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene, what did he say? He said, I am. Or I am he, as it's often translated. And what did it do? It knocked them all off the ground, knocked them to the ground. He was in complete control, but he allowed himself to be bound. And as we talked about last week, are we willing to be voluntarily bound for Christ? Are we willing to take up our cross and follow him down that pathway of suffering? Of course, we need to be encouraged to do so. But in verse 13 it says, and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Okay, so there's some confusion here, because in verse 19 we're going to see Annas being called the high priest. He's talking about Annas there. It says the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples, and then after this questioning, then in verse 24, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And some people have kind of knocked at the Gospel of John because of this. Historically, we know that Caiaphas was only high priest between AD 5 and AD 14, somewhere around in there. And he was actually deposed by the Romans at that particular time. And so we'd say, well, why is John calling him the high priest if he wasn't legally the high priest? And there's different ways to deal with it. It shouldn't be a showstopper here or anything like that. Basically, one of the ways that you can explain this is by saying that, well, the Romans are the ones that ousted Caiaphas. And knowing the Jewish mindset and their attitude towards the Romans, it could be that even though the Romans kicked him out as high priest, the Jews are saying, you don't determine who's the high priest, we determine who's the high priest. And so in their minds, even though legally he couldn't perform as the high priest, as the religious leader of the Jews, still in the Jewish mind, they might have still considered him as the rightful high priest at the time. The other way to look at it is, well, he used to be high priest, and so out of respect, they continue to call him the high priest. We do this today. Past presidents, even though they're not actually the president, we still say, President Clinton or President Bush, whenever we address a previous president. And that might be taking place here as well. You might just be calling him the high priest because he used to be the high priest. Another way to look at it is it could have just been because of his influence. He's the father-in-law of the actual legal high priest, Caiaphas. And so he might have had such influence in what went on that they treated him as though he was a high priest. So it's easy to explain away. It's not something that should completely just shatter our faith or anything like that. But John here is just sticking to what, he's speaking in the first century. He writes this in the first century, and people who had read it originally would have known what he was talking about, would have found no discrepancy here at all. But anyways, he takes him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas. So this isn't an official trial. This would be more like a pre-trial. They're going to investigate. They're going to, put Jesus under the lamp and say, like they do where they interrogate someone and they try to get him to confess to something. That's kind of what's going on here, and we'll see some elements of that here. So they want to put him before Caiaphas because of the prestige, the fact that he used to be high priest, but eventually they're going to have to actually take him before Annas to question him, but ultimately they'll have to take him to Caiaphas to actually get anything legally done against him. Verse 4 says, "Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people." Which takes us back to John chapter 11. So John's explaining, okay, this is the same guy we had talked about in chapter 11. If you remember there, Caiaphas had prophesied that it would be expedient for one man to die and not the whole nation. So they had concluded, okay, this Jesus is the man who has to die to save the rest of Israel, the rest of the nation. Now, instead of interpreting that as, okay, he's the Messiah who will die and take away our sins, Isaiah 53, they interpreted it as, we got to kill this guy to save the rest of the nation. And so now that put them on hot pursuit of Jesus. And we talked about it back then. That's why it's so important to accurately interpret prophecy and things, to make sure you are acting in line of the right things. Here they misinterpreted that prophecy, and they're out to get him. And John clarifies and makes sure that we know that this is the same God, because what this does is it clues us in on what the motivation is for Jesus being crucified, at least as far as Caiaphas is concerned. Historically, we know Caiaphas was a pretty rotten guy anyways to begin with. Even though he had prophesied, that doesn't mean that he was this great spiritual guy. And so a lot of that plays a factor in this whole pursuit of Jesus. But then the scene switches to Peter. And John does this a little bit different. He doesn't just talk about the denial of Christ, Peter, in one big swoop, in one story. What he does is he takes part of the section of that story, inserts it here, and then we'll have Jesus being questioned in verses 19 through 26, and then it'll go back to Peter again. It's almost as though John here is kind of holding what Peter's doing in contrast to what's going on with Jesus, showing basically that Jesus is going through this trial alone. That even Peter, the one that was so prestigious, and at this time when the Gospel of John was written, people knew who Peter was and what an influence he was in the church. Even he was forsaking Jesus at this particular point. Also, this denial of Jesus, of Peter, inserted here in John chapter 18, will help better clarify also what's going to be spoken about in chapter 21, in verses 15 through 17, when you have Jesus asking him, "Do you love me?" 3 times. Basically giving him a chance 3 times to kind of undo those denials that he did. So it's here for probably several reasons, but we at least have it here. This also goes back to the upper room when Jesus told him that he was going to deny him as well. So we could look backwards or forwards. But in verse 15 it says, "Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest." All right, so Peter was following him at a distance. We're told in other places. He wasn't going through the trial with Jesus. He was just following him and kind of just observing what's going on. Which shows that, sometimes we can follow Jesus, but not really be following Jesus, not really be in there with Jesus, in the sufferings, in the hardships, in the difficulties. We say we're following Jesus, but we're just looking on. We're just spectators, looking on at what's going on in connection to Christ and not actually being involved. That's kind of what Peter's doing here. It mentions a disciple, and that this disciple was known to the high priest. And he doesn't give the name of the disciple, which would be common in the Gospel of John, because John, oftentimes when he was talking about himself, didn't mention his name. He was always known as the unnamed disciple in the Gospel of John. And so it's oftentimes assumed that this is John, this disciple who knew the high priest, helped Peter get into this court of the high priest. But some have kind of pushed back on that and said, well, we know that John was a fisherman. Would he really have? Oh, and by the way, this where it says he was known to the high priest, that word for known is in connection to was in a close relationship with. It's not just he just knew him as an acquaintance. He actually had intimate knowledge of the high priest there. And so it's questioning, would John really have been in connection with the upper echelons of religious society at this time? And so it's questioning whether this was actually John or maybe another disciple. Some have even, or at least one person has even postulated that maybe it was Judas, because Judas obviously had free access to the priests and things like that, and to the religious leaders. I don't think there's really any scriptural, really solid foundation we could build that idea on, but it's one of the things that's been postulated. In the end, I think this probably is talking about the Apostle John, and I don't think we should be too surprised that he would actually be familiar with the high priest. Remember, he's the son of Zebedee, and Zebedee was a pretty prestigious person. We're told in other places that he actually owned slaves. You see also the mother of James and John, the wife of Zebedee, wanting them to have a high position with Jesus, which would have been an interest of someone who was in the upper echelons of society. Hey, I want my sons to be up there at your right hand. Just because he was a fisherman doesn't necessarily mean that his family wasn't from this order. As a matter of fact, there's a historical record. Eusebius actually says that he was an early Christian, one of the church fathers, would say that John was a part of the priesthood. Not a part of the priesthood, but he was of the priestly line, for whatever that's worth. And so I don't think that would be too far-fetched to say that this is actually John, who's letting Peter in to the court of the high priest. And this court of the high priest isn't an official court like we think about it. It's just like a courtyard in front of the high priest's home, Annas' home. So they're taking him to Annas' residence. They're not taking him before an actual courtroom. So clarify that. But John has access into this courtyard, into this court, and he takes Peter in there with him. In verse 16 it says, "But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went in and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in." In verse 17, "Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, 'You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?' And he said, 'I am not.' Now the slaves," verse 18, "and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself." Notice there the contrast. Jesus is on trial. Jesus is suffering. He's about to be, struck for the first time. He's about to really enter into the physical persecution and that he's going to undergo, even up to crucifixion. And what is Peter doing? He's seeking his own comfort. He's warming himself up by the fire. Jesus is on trial, about to be put to death, and Peter's worried about being warm, being comfortable, and also distancing himself from Jesus in connection to the rest of the crowd. The question is, are we doing the same thing? As we read about the sufferings of Christ, and we're here on Sunday morning, we're thinking about all the horrible and horrific things that Jesus went through. Is it just something we think about on Sunday morning and then we go back to our comfort, to our own self-pleasure and things like that? Or are we really going out there to proclaim Christ, be bold in our proclamation of Jesus as King, and being willing to suffer with him whenever the opportunity presents itself? We don't want to be like Peter in this particular example. But then it goes back to the questioning in verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said." All right, now is Jesus getting smart with the high priest here? One of the officers seems to think so, but he's not he's not being flippant or anything like that. Jesus seems to be speaking legally here, saying, you know what? You guys are trying to get me to incriminate myself. And by the way, that was against Jewish rule. You were not supposed to allow a person who was on trial, you were not supposed to force him to incriminate himself. And that seems to be what Annas is doing here, trying to get him to give an open confession, to incriminate himself by getting him to speak. And Jesus is saying, no, I've spoken publicly. Everybody knows what I've spoken about. Why don't you bring in some witnesses? Why don't you bring in some other people who have heard what I had to say and question them? Don't get me in this position where you're trying to get me to incriminate myself. So question them. Now, when we think about it in connection to today's world, in our dealings with people in connection to Christ and things, oftentimes a lot of people want this from Jesus. And I've had conversation with at least one individual, if not more, where they say, you know what, if Jesus is really the king, if Jesus really is true, why doesn't he show me some miracle, or why doesn't he come to me personally and tell me that he is the Messiah, or something like that? We want Jesus to come to us, or some people might want Jesus to come to them, appear to them personally. If Jesus really wants me to believe in him, why doesn't he just stand here right now before me and say, hey, I'm Jesus, I'm the Messiah, you need to follow me? And some people are actually looking for that. But we could say the same thing Jesus says here. Look, everything I did was publicly done. Everything's documented. We got reputable witnesses. We have reliable witnesses that testify to what happened. We even have extra biblical, historical documentation of people who are antagonistic against Christians, who are actually inadvertently and speaking against Christians, actually verified many of the main points of the death and crucifixion of Jesus Christ in there. It's been publicly done. It wasn't done in secret. Everybody knows about it. What Jesus has spoke, what Jesus has taught, has been written down and documented for us. Why don't you go to them, Jesus could say, and listen to what they had to say about what I taught, what I did, the miracles I performed, the great teachings that I gave. The same thing could be said today. And so we have tremendous resources in our day and age to go back and really look at the things that Jesus had done historically and also biblically as well, which is also historical, I might add. In verse 22, when he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answered the high priest?" Very interesting. This is the first time that we have recorded, at least in the story of Jesus, have recorded that Jesus is actually struck. Oftentimes they wanted to get at him. They wanted to throw him off a cliff at one point. They wanted to stone him at another point. He always passed through their midst. And no one could really get their hands on him. We've seen him now willingly being bound. He could have escaped from that as well. And now we see him even submitting to being struck. And this will only be the beginning of more. We don't have it in the Gospel of John, but later when he's standing before the Sanhedrin, they'll be striking him and saying, "Prophesy, who struck you?" And they're going to be really getting after Jesus. We're going to see also the soldiers striking him, mocking him as king. He's going to be struck a lot, but this is the first time in the story of Jesus that he is actually struck, which is, I think, significant. This is the beginning of the physical persecution of Jesus, or the physical sufferings of Jesus, we could say. In verse 23, Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me?" Again, Jesus is calling them to bring testimony. If you got something against me, don't just strike me. If I'm saying something wrong, don't just physically hit me. Testify. Give some evidence. Come before and actually give a testimony of why you know I'm speaking wrong. Of course, this officer knew he wasn't speaking wrong. Everyone knew that Jesus was speaking publicly. He taught in the temple. He taught before people. It was a very public thing, so much so that they had a very hard time arresting him because of the crowd. And this guy knew that Jesus was telling the truth. He knew that there was a lot of people who could have been brought forward as witnesses to testify of what he had done, but yet he struck him. And Jesus, of course, answers him in that way. In verse 24, so Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And so that could either be seen as a separate trial, or this could be Caiaphas in connection with the Sanhedrin. And so this is going to be, could be the same thing. John doesn't really get into Jesus standing before the Sanhedrin or before Caiaphas, just mentions that he goes there. In verse 25, now we go back to the story of Simon Peter. It says, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. There he is warming himself, comforting himself once again. So they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. I wonder if they're saying this because they're wondering why he's warming himself, why he's not in there defending Jesus. Just a thought I actually just had. Maybe I wonder if that's an element there in this. It's like, aren't you one of his disciples? Shouldn't you be going in there and defending your rabbi? Could be possible. In verse 26, one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. All right, so this is another reason why I think this unnamed disciple, was actually John. Notice how much John knows about the high priest. John is the only one of all four Gospels that actually mentions Malchus. He knows the name of the guy whose ear was struck off. And this Malchus was the high priest's slave, verse 26, one of the slaves of the high priest. Being a relative, was in the garden with them. So this guy, the high priest slave in verse 10, it calls him the high priest slave, Malchus, cut off his ear. John knew that this was the high priest slave. He also knew him by name. And then in verse 26, you also see that this guy, John recognized this guy who questions Peter as being a relative of the one whose ear he cut off. So John seems to have a lot of insider information here in his rendition here. So again, that just, I think, brings more weight to the fact that this unnamed disciple was John. And then Peter denied it, and again, immediately a rooster crowed. And that was, of course, according to Jesus' prophecy, that before the rooster crowed, he would deny him 3 times. And, there's a time, I know this is going to sound a little strange, but, there's going to be a time when the rooster crows in our lives. There's going to be a time when the rooster crows. There's going to be a time when the end comes again, when Jesus comes again. There's going to be a time of reckoning. The question is, what are we going to be doing when the rooster crows? What's going to be our mindset? Are we going to be standing up for Christ, being bold in our connection to Christ, and living out a life before God through Christ when the rooster crows? Or will we be caught denying him and living our own life, comforting ourselves and looking after our own things? Will we be loving the Lord with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, being committed to Christ, loving others, being committed to the kingdom of heaven when the rooster crows? Or will we be denying him? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. But one day, a day of reckoning will come. The moment of reckoning will come, and we have to ask ourselves, where will we be at that time? Then verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. The praetorium was the governor's official residence. It was kind of his house. And a Jewish person could go into a person's yard. They could go into a Gentile's yard. They could hang out in the courtyard. They could hang out, under the colonnade or whatever. They could be on the residence, but they couldn't step into a Gentile's house. As soon as they stepped into a Gentile's house, they were considered unclean. And so here they're at Pilate's house, at his residence, and they're outside. They're allowed to be outside, but they don't want to step into Pilate's house because he's a Gentile. If they do so, they'll become unclean. And not only would they be unclean, but because Gentiles were so known for handling the dead, and even, of course, I know a lot of people are shocked that even in the first century abortions were taking place, and the Gentiles just weren't as careful about handling the dead as the Jewish people were. And so what they would do was, just in case that Gentile also had touched someone dead and had become unclean because of deadness, according to the law, if you did that and came into contact with that, you were unclean for 7 days. And so they would, if they came into a Gentile's home, they would actually go through the purification process for 7 days, just in case that Gentile had touched someone who was dead. And so what that means in this particular context is that if they step into Pilate's home, they're defiled for 7 days. What's going on for those 7 days? Well, one, you have the Passover meal, but then also you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread taking place that whole week. So they would have missed out on the whole shebang. They would have missed out on the whole festival, and they didn't want to do that. So they say, you know what, we can't step in there And then we see in verse 29, Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation are you bringing against this man? So Pilate is accommodating them by going out to them. But also notice the irony here. They're so particular about not being unclean or not going into a Gentile's home, becoming unclean. They want to make sure they're able to partake of the Passover. But the fulfillment of the Passover is right there. They're actually wanting to put the true Passover, as we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, to death. And yet they don't want to defile themselves because they don't want to miss the Passover that was just a type and a shadow of the true Passover, which was Jesus. And yet they're doing this. This is in fulfillment with what Jesus said. You strain at a gnat and you swallow a camel. And they're swallowing the camel completely, wholesale. And they're putting the very Messiah they were hoping for to death, or they're trying to at this point, all the while being meticulous about particular rules and things like that. You could also do a whole study on just how many rules, their own rules, they broke, right? One, trying to get Jesus to incriminate himself. We already talked about that. But bringing false witnesses, that was a big no. You definitely didn't do that under the old law. If you brought false accusation against someone, you were supposed to bear the penalty of the person that you were trying to get convicted. And they violated that. There's just a lot of ways in which they broke the rules. But yet here they're being particular about this specific rule and just showing their inconsistency and their inconsistency. But he says, what accusation do you bring against this man? You know, waking me up in the wee hours of the day, bringing this person before me. What's the big deal? Why are you bringing this accusation? In verse 30, they answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Now, this is a very general statement. If you go in the Gospel of Luke, they give more detail. This guy is causing all kinds of trouble, this, that, and the other. They go into a lot more detail, telling people not to pay taxes. But here it's just a general statement. This might have been their very first statement to Pilate. Thinking that, okay, well, Pilate's going to trust us. Maybe he'll just take us for our word. But when he doesn't, then they go and give the details that Luke brings out. John just brings out the general accusation against him. If he wasn't an evildoer, we would not delivered him to you. In verse 31, so Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. Again, if we really think about this in the context of the Christian persecution in the first century, that was exactly the Roman attitude. How many times was Paul brought before Roman officials and things, and they're like, look, if this has to do with your laws and about names and things like that, tend to that yourselves. That was kind of their attitude. Like, don't come bringing us these religious situations and things like that. That's not what we're about. There wouldn't be a riot. They were really big about that. And that's usually when they would step in to try to avoid a riot, which seems to be what Pilate's doing here, or will eventually do. But this is kind of the attitude of the Roman government. It says, you know what, see to that yourself. You judge him according to your law, according to your religion. But the Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. That could be because under Roman law, they weren't allowed to execute a person, an individual. Or maybe it was in connection to the Passover. Because it was the Passover, to kill someone, you'd be handling the dead, might make them unclean. But for whatever reason, they didn't feel like they had the jurisdiction or the authority to put him to death. But this was ultimately to fulfill Scripture, verse 32, to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Remember, previously in the Gospel of John, he says, if I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. That was an allusion to the crucifixion. Even the crowds recognized that he was talking about the crucifixion at that point. And so he had already prophesied that this was going to take place. Also, Psalm 22 is a good reference for crucifixion. They pierced my hands and my feet. Think about that. Hundreds, or actually 1,000 years before crucifixion was even a thing. Before the Romans even started this whole idea of crucifixion, it was already prophesied that the Messiah would have his hands and his feet pierced. So it was a fulfillment of Jesus' words, but also a fulfillment of Scriptures thousands of years before that he would be crucified. And then in verse 33, therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, are you king of the Jews? So Jesus apparently is now in his residence, in his home. And Pilate goes in to question him. He says, are you the king of the Jews? In verse 34, Jesus answered, Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Now, it could be here Jesus is trying to parse out here. Okay, are you asking me this from a Roman perspective? In other words, are you asking me, am I insurrectionist? Am I speaking out against Caesar? Am I trying to usurp the authority of Caesar? Are you asking from yourself from a Roman standpoint? Or did others tell you about me? Are you taking it from a Jewish standpoint that I am the Messiah, that I am the King of the Jews? And which angle are you taking, Pilate? In verse 35, Pilate answered, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done? Okay, so Pilate's just saying, look, let's get down to the nitty gritty. What did you do? I'm still trying to figure out what the exact accusation is here. What have you done that's really worthy of death? And in verse 36, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. So Jesus is testifying here that, if I was really trying to create this big insurrection against Rome, we'd be fighting. But there has been no fighting. And the only little bit of fighting where Peter, cut Malchus's ear, Jesus rebuked him. And we find in another account that he actually healed him and put his ear back on, showing that he's not trying to create violence. He's not trying to create a riot. He's not trying to do anything physically. He's speaking about a heavenly kingdom. And he's the king of the heavenly realm. Remember in chapter 6 of John, what were they trying to do when he fed the 5,000? They were trying to take him by force and make him king. And Jesus went away. He didn't want to have any part in that. Jesus wasn't trying to become a physical king to rule over a physical realm, but he was bringing a message of a heavenly kingdom, of which he was a king, that the physical kingdom was only a picture of and a pointer towards. And that's what we have to remember too. Our kingdom is not of this world. When we say we are a part of the kingdom of heaven, that's exactly what we are. We're a part of the kingdom of heaven. Our citizenship is in heaven. And that's where our minds should be. That's where our hearts should be. That's where our love should be. That's where our devotion should be, in heaven. Oftentimes we become so earthly mindset. We become so concerned about the things of the world and the concerns and the anxieties and the cares of the world choke out the seed in our lives and overtakes us. We got to remember that we need to lift up our eyes, look to things above, not on the things of the earth. Colossians 3 teaches us. Remember where the kingdom is from. This will also help us from being violent. Help us to realize we don't have to bully people. We don't have to try to be ugly to people, try to force people to come to Christ. That's not what we're about. Paul says to the Corinthians, he says, our warfare is not carnal, but for the tearing down of strongholds and changing people's mindset and their ideologies and turning their hearts to God. That's what we're concerned about. Not just physically getting people to follow some idea in a physical and in a violent way. In verse 37, therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king. And Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. But I'm not the king the way that you're thinking. It's maybe the way that maybe what he's thinking in the back of his mind. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. You can believe a truth, and you can also be of the truth. You can be in the realm of truth and in the realm of reality and truth. Jesus here seems to be speaking even more broadly than just believing a truth, but actually living in accordance to that truth. Everyone who is of the truth, everyone who loves the truth, everyone who lives according to truth, hears my voice. You can live according to truth, or you can live according to a false idea, or a false philosophy, or a false ideology. But if you really are in the realm of the truth, or you're in the realm of reality, you'll hear my voice, and you'll know what I'm saying. This also echoes what he talked about in chapter 10, right? As he's a good shepherd. The good sheep, or the sheep, know my voice. I called out and they know my voice. Those who are of the truth hear Jesus, they hear his voice, and they follow him. And then verse 38, Pilate said to him, what is truth? Isn't that the big question in our society today? What is truth? This seems to be a way in which Pilate is just trying to push the whole issue aside. It could be he's just, but I think the statement itself has tremendous impact. During the modern era, like in you could go all the way back to the Enlightenment, all the way up to the early 20th century, the 1950s and onward. During modernity, the answer to that question was truth is only what you can put in a lab. Only thing you can create a hypothesis. You can go through the scientific method and you can prove it. That's how you come across truth. It has to be put to the test scientifically. But then modernity kind of turned into post-modernity. And then we get into a postmodern world where we say, well, there is no truth. Your truth is as good as my truth. And it's really weird. We actually kind of live in a society where there's a mixture of that, right? Well, if you can't prove it scientifically, I don't believe it. And then turn around 5 minutes later and say, well, you believe that, and that's okay for you, but I'll believe what I believe, and it doesn't matter because your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. It's kind of a weird mixture that we have today of both of these elements. But the main thing goes down to, what is truth? What does it mean to have truth? Well, truth is what's true. And sometimes you can't have two things being the truth. Either one thing's true or the other thing is true. That's true in this world with physical objects and things like that, but it's true in spiritual things as well. Why would we think in the physical realm that either I'm sitting in the stool or I'm not sitting in the stool, and those things both can't be true at the same time? But yet when it comes to religious things, we say, well, one person's religion can be true while another person's religion is true. Especially when they have contradictory ideas. As much as we don't like that, as much as we'd like to say, everybody's religion is true, it just can't be true. One thing is true and one thing is not true a lot of times. And so that's a big question that we need to ask ourselves. What is truth? How can I follow truth? And how can I be of the truth? How can I live in the realm of the truth and be in connection to the truth in that way? In verse 38, it continues on. He says, and when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. All right, so who knows what Pilate's really thinking right now? His wife had a dream about Jesus and told him not to have anything to do with this man. He actually investigates and he finds no guilt. Maybe he thinks Jesus is just a religious guru, some guy who's, just speaking religiously, so he doesn't really see any harm in what he's saying. Whatever the case is and whatever he's thinking, he doesn't see anything to justify actually putting him to death. Okay. Verse 39, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I released for you the King of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. And when you collect information on Barabbas from all the Gospels, you find that he was more than just a robber. That was part of what he did, but he was an insurrectionist. He was a murderer. We say in our vernacular today, he was a scoundrel. He was just a person that was up to no good. He was probably the Jeffrey Dahmer of their society. Everyone knew that he was a bad guy. And yet, they asked for Barabbas instead of Jesus. They took the man who actually was an insurrectionist, all the while accusing Jesus of being an insurrectionist when he wasn't an insurrectionist. And so there's this trade. And we won't go into this in a whole lot of detail. We don't have time to. Plus, we've talked about this in the previous Gospels. But this is a picture of us. Aren't we all Barabbas? We may not be insurrectionists or robbers or murderers, but we're all the ones who should have been guilty. We're all the ones who should have been put on the cross. But what happened? Jesus took our place. Jesus takes the place of Barabbas by dying on the cross that Barabbas should have been hung by. But the same thing is true with us as well. God the Father allowed us to go free from our sins, free from guilt, free from condemnation, and put Jesus on the cross for us in the place of us. And that's how we have been able to find salvation. So again, we could think about what an injustice this is, how bad it is, how horrible it is, but we also got to think, okay, this kind of looks like us. That's what happens with us as well. And there it wasn't because of injustice, it was because of love, because of the love of the Father that he had for us, that he was willing to do that. And Jesus willingly went through it on our behalf. So that concludes chapter 18, and it also concludes our lesson this morning. If you're here today and you want to give your life to Christ, you want to connect yourself to Him. Maybe because you've stepped into the realm of truth and you hear His voice, and you hear His voice calling you. Heed His voice. Turn to Him. Turn to the Good Shepherd. Become a part of His flock. Become a part of His people. Love Him with all your heart. Be committed to Him, devoted to Him. And you'll find a friend like you never had before. One who's always there for you, and one who will impart to you forgiveness of sins and also eternal life. So if you want to turn your life over to Jesus now, please come forward and we'll walk you through that process. John will lead us in the invitation song now.